Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the uh, Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team webinar series. We are tickled to have John Metzger from Transover with us today. John grew up on a dairy and beef farm near Leicester, Iowa, completed his bachelor's degree in dairy science from Iowa State and a master's degree in animal science and dairy cattle breeding from the University of Minnesota. Prior to working for Transover, he was employed by Northern Ohio Breeders Association in Tifton and Riverview Dairies in Morris, Minnesota. He's been a team member at Transover Genetics for 21 years and is currently responsible for developing embryo products for dairy and beef producers. Today, he will summarize the costs and keys to implementing a successful embryo transfer program that includes putting beef embryos in dairy cows. John, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, Fred. I appreciate it. So we'll go ahead and get started. If you can all see the screen.
Yep.
So I'm not going to read through this slide for you. I'm just because Transover Genetics is owned by a publicly traded company, I'm required to include that information. So we'll move on from that. So as I started putting this presentation together, I got to looking back in the past, and what a difference 15 years makes. In 2006, there was such a shortage of dairy replacement heifers that Holstein embryos were being put into beef cows. Today, because of the excess supply of dairy replacement heifers and feeder cattle, beef embryos are being put into dairy cows. The purpose of this presentation is to share information about the economics of this practice and the keys to success for an embryo transfer program. In order to maximize the profit of your operation, it's important to produce no more dairy replacement heifers than you need because of the high cost of raising heifers. Furthermore, these heifers should be produced from your females, which have the highest genetic merit for profitable milk production, using sex semen from bulls that also have the highest genetic merit for profitable milk production. Your lower genetic merit females should be mated with beef semen or used as embryo recipients to produce calves that can be sold at the highest profit possible, taking into consideration the cost of producing those calves. An additional option would be to produce embryos from your very highest genetic merit females, or even purchase embryos of that kind of genetic level and transfer them into your lower genetic merit females to produce some of your replacement heifers. Let's compare the cost of producing a beef dairy crossbred calf through artificial insemination, or AI, to producing a straight beef calf through embryo transfer, or ET. I've inserted what I think might be appropriate numbers, but these numbers will likely be different for every operation. I assumed a cost of $10 for a straw of beef semen and $5 to have the cow inseminated, for a total cost of $15. The cost of beef embryos to put into dairy cows that I'm aware of range from $40 to $75, so I use $60 for this example. The cost to have an embryo transferred has a big range from $10 to $75 each, and for this example I used $25, and so the total cost is $85. Assuming a 50% success rate, or 2 services per calf for AI, and a 40% success rate, or 2.5 services per calf for ET, means that the total cost to produce an AI calf is $30 compared to $170 for an embryo transfer calf. In this example, it would cost $140 more to make a straight beef calf with ET compared to a beef dairy crossbred calf with AI. If you believe that you will be able to sell a straight beef calf for over $140 more than a beef dairy crossbred calf, then in this situation, putting beef embryos into some of your dairy cows may be a good option for you. One note of caution if you have Jersey cows and are considering the use of beef embryos is the birth weight difference of the resulting calves. The expected average birth weight of a purebred Jersey calf is 60 pounds with a maximum expected birth weight of 85 pounds. The average expected birth weight of a beef embryo calf is 85 pounds with a maximum expected birth weight of 120 pounds. Because of this large difference in expected calf birth weights, beef embryos used for Jersey cows should be from calving sires that are expected to produce calves with lower birth weights. Putting beef embryos in Holstein cows doesn't have this same issue because the average birth weight of a purebred Holstein calf is the same as that of a beef embryo calf. If you're interested in using embryo transfer in your herd, there are 3 critical factors for success. An embryo transfer program will not be successful if any one of these factors, embryo, recipient, or transfer quality, is lacking. The embryo that you use should have been evaluated, packaged, and stored according to the standards of the International Embryo Transfer Society. Frozen embryos stored in liquid nitrogen must be protected from being thawed and refrozen, which can happen if they are raised above the level of the frost line in your storage tank for more than 2 seconds. Preventing thawing and refreezing is even more critical for embryos than semen because an embryo straw contains 1 embryo with only 128 cells compared to a semen straw that contains at least 2 million sperm cells. Thawing and refreezing kills the cells, and if an embryo has too few cells that are alive, it will not make a pregnancy or produce a calf. The second factor for success is the recipient that receives the embryo. To become pregnant, the recipient must be at the right stage in her heat cycle, 7 days after ovulation, when she receives the embryo. Without accurate heat detection or effective estrus synchronization of the recipient, an embryo transfer program will not be successful. It is not possible to palpate a recipient on the day of transfer and accurately determine if her CL or corpus luteum is 7 days old. An additional recipient factor for success is caring for recipients so that they have a low level of stress. This includes not only nutritional status of the recipient, but her housing and social environment. Anything that creates stress for the recipient will make her less likely to retain the 7-day-old pregnancy that was placed in her on the day of embryo transfer. Recipients should be chosen from groups of cows that have a high rate of success in an AI program, such as first or second services, first or second lactation, and no disease events since calving. Recipients should also be at least 70 days in milk so that the thickness of the uterine wall has returned to normal after calving, which will allow easier manipulation of the reproductive tract during the embryo transfer procedure. Repeat breeders that are infertile because of scarring in their fallopian tubes may benefit from embryo transfer because it bypasses the oocyte fertilization process, which is required when artificial insemination is used. The third and final factor for success is the quality of the embryo transfer procedure. The embryo must be deposited in the middle 1/3 of the uterine horn, just past the point where the uterus splits into the two different horns and the horns curve. The diagram over on your left shows the blue star is the site or location for embryo placement, and for comparison purposes, the red star shows where semen is deposited for artificial insemination. Additionally, the embryo must be transferred in the horn on the side which the recipient ovulated, which will have a CL. And the transfer procedure should not take a long time or require excessive manipulation of the reproductive tract. Either of these can cause damage to the lining of the horn of the uterus or the release of prostaglandin, both of which will prevent pregnancy from occurring. Embryo transfer is a technology that has the potential to bring great value to dairy and beef producers. The greatest barrier to adoption of embryo transfer by cattle producers is a shortage of people in the United States who can effectively transfer embryos. If you or someone in your operation is interested in becoming an embryo transfer technician, I would encourage you to explore that career option. The key requirement for success is having the time and follow through to practice. To become successful at anything, you must practice it correctly a minimum of 5 days a week until you have mastered it. For embryo transfer, this would mean completing left and right dry transfers, which means passing an ET gun where it should be moved to without an embryo. And that should be done on 5 cull cows per day, 5 days per week. And so you would basically be getting 50 repetitions in per week. To track your progress, you should record the date, cow ID, and the time to complete each dry transfer, because as you become more proficient at the procedure, it'll take you less time to complete it. Once you've done enough practice transfers to feel comfortable, you can begin transferring a small number of inexpensive embryos into ideal recipients and monitor the conception rates. However, as you're transferring actual embryos, you should not stop doing those 10 dry transfers per day, 5 days a week. You should not stop doing that until you've achieved a 40% conception rate or 12 pregnancies from the transfer of the last 30 embryos that you transferred. And so I thank everybody for their time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you would have.
We can go ahead, and because we've got a fairly small number on with us today, you can unmute yourself and ask questions as we go along here. If not, I'm going to start with what's your recommended breeding management system? Cedars, double off sync, what do you see working best for embryos?
So Fred, that's a good question. I mean, again, probably the first go-to answer is, well, that depends. And of course it does. I would say probably the dairies that we have seen have the best success probably do one of two things. They either would do, a double OVSync and timed embryo transfer program, or herds that have activity monitors and can pinpoint when estrus occurred, because they can see the peak on the graph and then transfer the embryos 7 days later. That's in that situation, you have to have somebody either on the farm or that's not very far away, because the transfers would have to happen multiple days per week, whereas with a timed embryo transfer program, the technician can come just 1 day a week. And so, so as I was talking about having someone in your operation do the transfers, it certainly gives you more flexibility, but it's there's a steep learning curve and some other things to take care of as well.
John, one question I would have is just when you take a look at the Jersey cows trying to calve out a cross, we know that our Jersey cows probably calve everything easier than the other breeds. Is it still a problem, do you think, because of the bigger calf?
Well, I think it's when you put an embryo, a beef embryo in a Jersey cow, she's not contributing any genetics to the size of the calf. If we were to say to AI a Jersey cow to a Holstein bull, as long as it wasn't, a really extremely difficult birth bull, that wouldn't be a problem for a Jersey cow, because she's contributing half the genetics. When you put that embryo in, it's contributing all of the genetics, and there's only so much she can do to limit that size, is what I think is going on. And then on top of that, a beef calf is thicker and heavier muscled, and so that they don't slide out as well as a Jersey calf would. And then there's a little bit of increase in calf size if the embryos are made with in vitro fertilization. And so it's all those factors together, but it's probably the biggest thing is you're putting a totally different genetic package in that cow and she's not really contributing to that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I appreciate you mentioning that, because I've just never thought about they're not putting any genetics into it. So,
which is, that's sort of the reason why this is being done, because if that Jersey cow can have a calf that doesn't have any Jersey genetics in it, that's better if it's a feeder calf.
Yeah, which is why we don't see the problem with it in crossbreeding, because they're putting their genetics into it. So,
right.
And let's follow up on that statement. What do you see as the possibilities in, for instance, pro-crossed herds, where you have a thicker animal to start with? Or do we see a benefit at the packer or in the feed yard, with a crossbred additional beef component in the genetics?
I think there's probably less of a benefit than with a herd with a higher Jersey component in the genetics of the calves. I think it's going to be dependent on every situation, and it really comes down to what is the market that you have for those calves and where they're going. If you're not going to feed them out yourself, then you really kind of got to do some due diligence and work with your buyer and discover what that price difference is between a half dairy, half beef, or a full beef calf. And some of that'll depend on at what age you're selling it, just all those kind of things. And so it's, there's not a clear cut answer for everybody. Fred, I see there was a chat. A question here was first put on at the very beginning that kind of dovetails into this. What has changed over time on the value of cross versus beef calves? And what's really happened there is, the discounts that were applied to Holstein steers and Jersey steers, now those discounts or reduced prices for those are being moved into the half dairy crosses. And I think a lot of it has to do with the quality of the genetics of the bull of the beef bull that was used, in the last 3 to 4 years, depending on what the dairy producer did, whether whether there was some selection applied and to the bulls that they were using, or whether they just asked for really cheap semen. And if it was really cheap semen, then more than likely, it was just semen that was being cleaned out of tanks in inventory at some of the bull studs or whatever it might be. And so as those calves are harvested, then they're seeing those kind of issues in it. And so the discounts are kind of moving that way. And it kind of points towards of having a place where those calves are going to go, and knowing what you're going to get there, and just working through the economics of that.
So what would you recommend to somebody who asks the question, compare the top genetic dairy embryos to beef embryos? Would they be better off saying, well, I want an animal that I can potentially, market in the dairy industry versus an animal that's going to go into the feedlot?
Okay, so you're asking, if I can maybe verify your questions, would it be an option to put in high genetic merit dairy embryos to make extra replacement heifers and sell those for a premium in the market?
Yep.
I certainly think that would be an option, probably as long as you're not shorting yourself on the genetic level, your females. And then it's really, can you get a price for those heifers that justifies the cost of rearing them? And probably one of the advantages of not producing any more heifers than you're going to raise is oftentimes to get to have a really marketable price on a dairy heifer. She almost needs to be 6 months pregnant. So you've got a lot longer time that you've taken care of those animals, where with a beef cross or straight beef calf, you could market them when they're born, or even you probably pick up a premium at 300 to 400 pounds when they're 6 months old, especially if you've been able to use some of your way back feed, some of your cheaper ration sources and hospital milk or something like that. There might be a niche for somebody that could find a real way to do that, and whether they want to retain ownership and feed them out all the way, or sell them to the feeder at a premium at that point.
Okay, do we have any other questions from the listeners?
Fred or John, I have a question. Do you have an idea of a percentage of herds that are either utilizing embryo transfer this way or are thinking about it? I mean, do you think this is kind of a growing trend in our industry?
From my perspective, at least the communication we get with customers or potential customers is there is a growing interest, and there are some that have already started implementing it. And I think most people are looking at it, unless they and it probably has more to do with what kind of price they're getting for their excess calves, for their beef cross dairy calves is probably what's driving this.
A couple years ago, we were seeing a $200 spread between that Holstein bull calf and that crossbred calf. Are you still seeing that at this point?
I probably don't ask enough and see enough, but I know a lot of dairies, those that I have talked to, have said the spread between dairy calves and beef dairy cross calves has shrunk compared to what it was a couple of years ago. there was a comment, one other comment on the chat that said, recent client stated he has the most margin when he uses a live Angus bull versus AI. And that that wouldn't surprise me. You know, you haven't got any labor in heat detection or insemination. So there might be, based on the situation, that could very well work. And, you know, and especially if the Angus bull doesn't get mean like a dairy bull does, I could see where that might work for someone.
In that particular herd, he was intentionally not producing any replacements.
Oh, okay.
You know, he was in southern Minnesota. He says, I've got a market where I can buy the kind of heifers that I want cheaper than what it costs me to raise them. So he was looking to sell those calves, maybe not day one after birth, but fairly quick.
Sure. Well, and I know we had a client that was planning over the next several years of getting out of the dairy business, and so he was purchasing beef embryos to make beef replacement cows, so to make beef replacement heifers, and he was going to transition to having a beef herd from a dairy herd. So I guess it just kind of shows you, you know, there's a lot of different ways to be able to use the embryo transfer technology to maybe move you somewhere faster than you could get with artificial insemination.
Very, very good. And thank you very much for sharing this information with us. And we'll talk to you at the next one.
You're welcome, and thank you for having me.